In a heated congressional hearing over a 10-year-old rape victim forced to give birth, Jasmine Crockett took just 5 minutes to dismantle Marjorie Taylor Greene, live on camera. One calm question silenced Greene and exposed the brutal truth behind so-called pro-life laws. The room froze. The internet exploded. And this moment is now being called the most honest thing Congress has witnessed in years. How long will it take before the pain of a child matters more than a political victory? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C., 9:03 a.m. The marble floors of the Rayburn House office building echoed under hurried steps as reporters flooded through security checkpoints, their voices low but urgent, cameras already rolling. The hearing room, normally cold, bureaucratic, sterile, had transformed into something closer to a battleground. Every seat was taken. Congressional aides lined the back wall like silent sentinels. Flashes from news crews painted the polished wood panels with white-hot bursts of light. At the center of this storm, a simple placard read, "Hearing on Federal Oversight of Reproductive Health Policy." But everyone knew what this was really about. A 10-year-old girl in rural Texas had been raped. She became pregnant. And under the newly enacted state law, she was denied the right to terminate the pregnancy. The nation had watched in horror. Now it was time for Congress to answer, though no one agreed on what the question even was. Marjorie Taylor Greene sat high on the dais, flanked by aides with tightly clutched binders and folded arms. Her blonde hair immaculately pinned, expression sharp as broken glass, she tapped her fingernails rhythmically against the microphone, like a metronome counting down to conflict. Greene had long positioned herself as a crusader for the unborn, but today she looked like a general preparing for war. She stared straight ahead, lips curled slightly, as if daring anyone in the room to flinch. Opposite her, seated calmly, but with a barely concealed tension in her jaw, was Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her deep brown eyes scanned the room, not for allies, but for the inevitable attack. Dressed in black, with a single silver pin in the shape of Texas over her heart, Crockett looked like someone who had buried too many truths to be polite today. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't going to be a policy discussion. This was a moral collision. The room fell into silence as the chairwoman called the hearing to order. But it wasn't a respectful silence. It was loaded, like a breath held too long, like the split second before lightning hits. Every journalist in the room knew this moment would define headlines for weeks. Every witness sitting at the long table before the committee glanced nervously at the representatives. These were not scientists or academics. They were doctors, nurses, and one young woman who had once faced a pregnancy at 13. Their presence said more than any statistic could. But in that room, their testimonies were merely accessories to the main event, the ideological showdown between Greene and Crockett. Red versus blue, control versus choice, faith versus fear, and above all, power cloaked in morality. And then, as if the silence itself had given her permission, Marjorie Taylor Greene struck like a match to gasoline. She leaned forward, posture rigid, voice soaked in condescension. "They call this a right?" she spat, eyes flashing as she reached beneath the desk. "Number, this is state-sanctioned murder." With a dramatic flick of her wrist, she unfurled a glossy trifold of printed images. Graphic, jarring, grotesque depictions of terminated fetuses, frozen mid-development like torn wings of something once human. She slammed them down one by one across the dais, their laminated surfaces flashing under the overhead lights. "Tell me, who speaks for them?" she challenged, voice rising like a preacher whipping a congregation into fury. "You sit here defending the rights of predators while the voiceless die in silence." Cameras zoomed in. Even some Republican aides looked away. The images weren't just provocative. They were psychological warfare, and Greene knew it. The gallery reacted in waves, gasps, shifting chairs, murmurs like distant thunder. Journalists scribbled in frenzy. One congressman from Nevada looked physically ill. But Greene wasn't done. She was performing, and she knew the script well. She turned sharply toward the center witness table, jabbing a finger at the young trauma nurse from El Paso who'd volunteered to testify. "You enable this," she barked. "You and your so-called compassion clinics, factories of death wrapped in a pink ribbon." The nurse's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she didn't speak. Crockett, meanwhile, remained still as stone. But her eyes, they locked onto Greene's like two storm fronts preparing to collide. What made it unbearable wasn't just the rhetoric. It was the blatant spectacle of cruelty paraded as morality. Greene wasn't there to debate. She was there to indict. Not a person in that room was safe from her accusations, especially not those who had seen the consequences of these laws up close. Her display wasn't for justice. It was for fear, for power, for control. And for a moment, it felt like the entire room had forgotten what real justice even looked like. But Crockett hadn't. She was waiting, measuring, letting the storm crash first, so her thunder would echo louder. But Greene wasn't finished. Her hand still hovered over the table like a dealer with more cards to throw, and this next hand was aimed squarely at the press. She pivoted with a venomous grace, eyes sweeping the rows of reporters with barely concealed contempt. "Let's talk about who's really pulling the strings," she sneered, voice rising with theatrical cadence. CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, all of them complicit. They don't just report the news anymore. They engineer it. They glorify abortion, they sanitize the horror, and they shove it down our throats under the disguise of women's health. She held up a printed article titled, "Abortion Access Saves Lives," and waved it like a weapon. "This is not journalism," she barked. "This is propaganda." Her fingers stabbed the air. "You people are the problem. You've built a culture that worships death and calls it progress." The cameras kept rolling, zooming tighter with every sentence. Somewhere in the back, a boom mic wobbled from a trembling grip. A young reporter lowered his camera for a second, unsure if he was filming a hearing or a hostage video. Greene's tone dipped into fire and brimstone fury. "You praise women for speaking their truth, but silence the ones who regret their abortions. You publish op-eds about bodily autonomy, but bury the stories of babies left to die after failed terminations. That's not freedom of the press. It's the manipulation of a nation." The journalists, for once, had no follow-up. Their pens slowed. Her eyes scanned the gallery like a sniper measuring her next shot. And on the other side of the room, Jasmine Crockett finally moved, just slightly, but her presence shifted like the pressure drop before a storm. Because Greene hadn't just launched an attack on reproductive rights. She had declared war on the very voices who dared to challenge her version of reality. And in that moment, the injustice felt personal, deliberate, designed. A full frontal assault not just on facts, but on those who lived with the consequences of their absence. And Crockett, still silent, felt every word like a match head scraping stone, waiting, sparking, burning. And with the media thoroughly scorched in her verbal firestorm, Greene turned her sights to the ideological heart of the hearing. Ready to deliver a blow meant not just to land, but to wound. She straightened her spine, as if rising into some imagined moral high ground, and lowered her voice into something slower, more calculated, like a blade being drawn. "Let's call it what it really is," she said, her southern drawl thickening with theatrical weight. "This so-called right to choose, it's not about women's health. It's about convenience. It's about escaping responsibility." Her words dripped with disdain, each one more poisonous than the last. "You're not fighting for freedom. You're fighting for the right to walk away from consequences." She paused, letting that sink in, letting the silence swell like a bruise. Then with a tilt of her head and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, she dropped the line meant to cut deepest. "We protect the unborn. Tiny hearts, tiny hands, tiny souls. And you," she turned to Crockett directly, voice laced with venom, "who exactly are you protecting?" The room tensed like a muscle before impact. Aides looked up from their phones. The nurse witness at the center table instinctively shifted back in her seat. A ripple of discomfort moved across the Democratic side of the aisle. But instead of rising to the bait, Jasmine Crockett did something far more dangerous. She remained silent. The room, already wound tight, seemed to draw itself inward. Breath held, eyes narrowing on the woman who refused to blink. Crockett sat perfectly still, the only movement coming from the slow glide of her pen across her notepad. Methodical, deliberate, like a surgeon charting incisions before an operation. Her jaw was tight, clenched just enough to betray restraint, and her eyes, God, those eyes, burned with a fury so contained it could have set the walls on fire. The camera found her and didn't look away, zooming in just close enough to catch the twitch in her temple, the tightening around her mouth, the fire behind her stare. She didn't scribble angrily. She wrote with the calm of someone who knew the exact weight of her words before speaking them. A staffer behind her adjusted in their seat, sensing it too. Something was building. Crockett didn't need to yell to be heard. She didn't need to flail to be feared. She was waiting, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was crafting a reckoning. In that moment, every insult Greene had just hurled about responsibility, about morality, about who deserved protection, hung in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fuse. But Crockett knew better than to chase smoke. She was watching the flame, watching Greene, and waiting for the precise moment to strike. Not with outrage, but with evidence. Not with volume, but with truth. Because this wasn't just politics for her. This was personal. This was home. This was about every woman she had ever known who had been talked over, shut down, or legislated into silence. And when Crockett finally opened her mouth, the silence would not return. And while Crockett sat in controlled stillness, like a storm eyeing its path, the tension around her began to shift, subtly but unmistakably. On the Democratic side of the aisle, glances passed like signals in a battlefield trench. A congresswoman from Illinois leaned in slightly, eyes darting toward Crockett, then back to her notes, bracing. A representative from California, arms folded, gave the smallest nod as if to say, "It's time." They knew her reputation. Jasmine Crockett didn't swing unless she was sure the blow would land, and when it did, it never missed. A junior staffer seated a few rows behind whispered to no one in particular, "This hearing's going viral before lunch. I'd bet my badge on it." His colleague beside him didn't even look up, just murmured, "She hasn't said a word, and yet she's already winning." There was a current in the room now, electrified by what hadn't happened yet. Crockett was loading her ammunition. Not bullets, but truth. And once she fired, no one would be able to hide behind party lines or righteous outrage. The Republican side tried to maintain composure, but even they could feel it. A few exchanged whispers, some checked their phones as if searching for a distraction, an anchor, anything to break the gathering weight. Greene, for all her confidence, adjusted her blazer and glanced once, only once, toward the woman she had just tried to humiliate. Crockett didn't return the look. She didn't need to. She was too busy preparing to drag the entire narrative into the light, one cold, undeniable fact at a time. Because everyone knew, the quieter she was now, the louder it would echo when she finally stood. And then, like a storm rolling in without thunder, Jasmine Crockett leaned into her mic and let the silence break. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with something far more dangerous. Truth delivered in a voice that refused to tremble. "If you've ever rushed your daughter to the emergency room at 3 in the morning, she began, her tone calm but deep with something heavier than rage, reality, then maybe, just maybe, you'd understand that this issue, it's not black and white. It's not about party lines. It's about what happens in the dark when no one is watching, when a child wakes up bleeding, in pain, scared out of her mind, and the only thing more terrifying than what's happening to her body is knowing there's no legal way out." Her words moved slowly, intentionally, like someone laying down bricks in a wall meant to stand forever. "I've seen those nights. I've answered those calls. And no mother, no father, should ever have to look at a 12-year-old child and say, 'There's nothing we can do. The law won't let us.'" She reached down and lifted a page from the folder in front of her, unfolding it with the reverence one gives the name of the dead. "This," she said, holding it just above the microphone, "is a CDC report from 2022. It tells us that girls under the age of 15 are 5 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than adult women." She looked directly at Greene now, voice still even but firmer. "That's not a talking point. That's not liberal media spin. That is a number, born of autopsy tables and hospital beds. It's real, it's measurable, and it is ignored. Her eyes swept across the room, catching faces that suddenly couldn't meet hers. Do you know what it means to bury a child who didn't even live long enough to understand what was done to her? She asked. Because that's what we're dealing with here. Not hypotheticals, not partisan fantasies, but little girls with soft voices and tiny hands who are forced to carry a pregnancy they didn't ask for, didn't want, and may not survive. She inhaled, held it. The air thickened, like something sacred had just been spoken. And yet somehow we call that policy. Then her voice dropped slightly, not in volume, but in weight. I need everyone in this room to hear me very clearly. This isn't just about rights. This is about risk. And if you can look me in the eye and say a child's life is worth sacrificing to prove a political point, then the blood isn't just on your hands. It's on your soul. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just let the truth hang there, heavy, unmovable, and devastatingly clear. And after letting the numbers land like thunder, Crockett allowed the room to breathe, just for a second, before guiding it straight into the eye of the storm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her power came not from volume, but from clarity, from truth so sharp it made people flinch. She was 10 years old, Crockett began again, slower this time, each word like a stone being laid in the foundation of something unshakable. 10 years. Old. Her voice didn't crack, but something in it lowered, as if speaking this truth required the strength from someplace deeper. I'm not going to say her last name. Not here, not in this room, because she's not a headline to be recycled or a case file to be debated. She was a child. Crockett's eyes drifted briefly to the back of the room, where a small group of nurses sat with arms folded, jaws tight. Her first name was Alina. That's all I'll give you. That's all she should have had to give anyone. She was taken to the ER in Texas by her aunt, she continued, pressing forward. The aunt didn't know what else to do. There was blood. A lot of it. Alina thought she was dying. Crockett's hands lay flat on the desk now, grounded. She didn't understand the pain, or the swelling, or why her stomach had started to change. She didn't know what was happening inside her, because no one had ever explained it. Because no one expected a 10-year-old to need that kind of conversation. Her voice lowered. She still slept with the lights on. She still watched cartoons before bed. She still believed in Santa Claus. And when they wheeled her into that hospital room, that cold white room that smelled like antiseptic and sounded like beeping monitors and muffled fear, she was still holding her teddy bear. Crockett paused, staring directly at the panel now. Let me repeat that for every member of this committee who wants to argue about legal precedent or states' rights, she was holding a stuffed animal. That's who your laws cornered. That's who your policies backed into a cage. Her fingers curled slightly on the desk, not in anger, but in control. She was 10. She should have been worrying about spelling quizzes or what snacks she'd bring to a sleepover. Instead, she was forced to carry a pregnancy that her body could barely survive. Because adults in this country decided that her trauma was less important than their politics. The stillness that followed wasn't silence. It was gravity. It was weight, pressing into the bones of everyone in the room. No one moved. No one dared. Crockett let it hang, let it settle into the cracks of their arguments, into the corners of their pre-written talking points. Alina asked one of the nurses if the baby would come out with a bow, she said. Like the ones on the dolls in commercials. She didn't even know where the baby was going to come from. Her voice was almost a whisper now, but somehow louder than anything Greene had shouted. She didn't know what sex was. She didn't understand why her body was hurting. She only knew that everyone around her was afraid, and that the law told them they couldn't help her. And you call that protection, Crockett said, now looking directly at Greene. You call that defending the innocent. She didn't blink. You tell the world you're saving lives, but what you're really doing is sacrificing little girls to protect your political purity. Then she leaned back slowly, deliberately. So the next time you hold up a poster of a fetus or wave a Bible in someone's face, I want you to remember this. Somewhere, in this country, there is a 10-year-old girl staring at a ceiling, holding a bear that soaked in her tears and wondering why no one ever came to save her. And in that moment, Crockett didn't just command the room, she changed it. And just as the chamber seemed to collapse into silence beneath the unbearable truth of Alina's story, it happened, predictably, violently, and with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Marjorie Taylor Greene's voice cracked through the air like a siren in a cathedral. "No one forced her to give birth," she barked, her words sharp and shrill, slicing the tension but not the truth. Her knuckles whitened against the edge of the desk as she leaned in, posture forward like a woman trying to shove the room back with her chest. "She chose life. Her family made that decision. They had options and they chose the right one." Her voice trembled with something more raw than conviction. Panic. Not panic of being wrong, but panic of being exposed. "You sit here painting this child as a victim of the law, but she's alive, isn't she? That's what you people forget. She's alive." The room didn't erupt. It recoiled. Greene's voice kept climbing, frantic now, a woman grasping for moral high ground as it crumbled under her feet. "You act like she was dragged into that hospital in chains, that some cruel judge signed her womb into service. That's not what happened." Her fist slammed once on the table, the sound hollow, performative. "Her aunt had a choice. Her doctors had a choice. Her family could have broken the law, but they didn't. They chose life." She pointed at Crockett now, finger trembling, eyes glassy with fury or desperation. It was hard to tell. "So don't come in here with your sanctimonious tears and your one-sided sob stories trying to shame the rest of us into thinking we're the monsters." Jasmine Crockett did not move. She didn't even blink. What Greene failed to understand, what the entire room was about to learn, is that Crockett had stopped playing by the rules of televised outrage a long time ago. She wasn't here to win airtime. She was here to end the illusion. And she began not with fire, but with frost. She was 10, Crockett said, each syllable deliberate, carved in ice. She was raped by someone she trusted. She didn't understand what was happening to her body. She thought she had a stomach bug. Crockett's voice didn't rise, but it deepened, like the earth opening just enough to show what lies beneath. She didn't understand pregnancy. She didn't understand trauma. She didn't understand choice. And you're sitting here telling this country, telling every parent watching this, that that child, who still needed help reaching the sink to brush her teeth, made a fully autonomous, legally sound decision to carry her rapist child to term? Her words did not echo. They hung, in the air, on the walls, in the back of every throat in that room. She couldn't ride a bike without training wheels. She didn't know how her own body worked. But you, Congresswoman Greene, are calling that a choice? Crockett leaned forward now, not to shout, but to cut deeper. That wasn't a decision. That was a death sentence disguised as obedience. And you're applauding it like it was heroism. Greene slammed her hand on the table again. You people don't care about truth. You only care about headlines. Her voice cracked as she practically screamed. You use blood, actual blood, to buy votes. You parade around these tragedies like trophies, turning them into attack ads. That's what you do. Her voice was ragged, a jagged edge of desperation. You want dead babies so you can call it freedom. The chairwoman tried again. Order, she said louder this time. But the hearing had already crossed into territory where rules didn't apply. Order, or I will gavel this room. Still, the yelling continued. Greene shouting, aides murmuring, a reporter gasping somewhere near the back. But Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. Her gaze didn't waver. Her voice, when it returned, was a scalpel. You scream about life, she said, steady as a heartbeat. But the only life you seem to care about is the one that can't ask you for food, or health care, or protection. Her tone sharpened. You say we use blood to win elections? But what about the blood on your laws? What about the blood of a 10-year-old girl who didn't even know what birth control was? Her hands, flat on the table, didn't shake. You want to protect a heartbeat you can't hear, but you ignore the cries of a child you could. Another beat. A pause so loud it silenced the room more than the gavel ever could. This isn't about life, Crockett said finally. It's about control. Control over bodies you'll never bleed from, never carry pain in, never bury trauma inside. You don't want to save children, you want to own them. Own their choices, own their futures, own their silence. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just take the floor, she became it. Unshakable, unignorable. And for the first time in the hearing, Marjorie Taylor Greene had nothing left to say. And as the echoes of Greene's outburst faded into something small and embarrassed, Jasmine Crockett didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply reached down, quiet and deliberate, and brought out what she had been saving. Not a speech, but evidence. A thick folder, frayed at the edges, worn like it had been read and reread in long nights by someone who knew every story inside was not a number, not a statistic, but a wound. She placed it on the desk with the reverence of someone setting down a headstone, not for one, but for many. No one breathed. She flipped it open slowly, fingers steady, not for effect, but because rushing truth is how it gets lost. Her voice didn't rise. It settled. "You want to talk about justice?" she said, not accusing, just asking a question no one in the room would be able to answer honestly. "Then let's talk about what that word really means for women in America today." She picked up the first sheet. Her eyes didn't waver. Latice Fisher, Mississippi, 2017. A mother of 3. She gave birth to a stillborn baby at home. She called for help. She was arrested, charged with second-degree murder. Her internet search history on how to safely terminate a pregnancy was used as evidence of intent. She didn't pause for dramatic effect. She paused for her dignity. The next page slid out like a verdict. Brittany Poolaw, Oklahoma, 2021. She was just 20 years old. Addicted, yes. Poor, yes. But when she miscarried at 17 weeks, the state charged her with manslaughter. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison for losing a pregnancy she never had the support to manage. Crockett looked up now, not to accuse, but to witness, to make sure everyone heard. Marcy Jones, Alabama, 2019. She was 5 months pregnant when she was shot in the stomach during an argument. Shot. The fetus died. The shooter walked free. She was the one arrested, charged with manslaughter for not protecting the life of her unborn child. A bitter breath passed through the chamber. Even some of Greene's aides had gone still. She was shot, and they blamed her. Crockett let the silence speak for a heartbeat longer, then raised the folder slightly off the table. There are more. So many more. Louisiana, Arizona, Tennessee, women investigated after miscarriages, jailed for stillbirths, denied counsel, shamed, alone. No lawyer, no doctor, just questions like, what did you do to lose that baby? As if every ounce of grief hadn't already swallowed them whole. She set the folder down again with finality, not to close it, but to ground it. Her voice grew heavier now, like it carried the weight of every woman inside those pages. They weren't criminals. They weren't threats. They weren't monsters. She leaned forward, steady, unflinching. They were poor. They were brown. They were forgotten. And what happened to them wasn't about law. It was about control. It was about telling every other woman in this country, this is what happens if you step out of line. Crockett placed her hand flat on the folder, fingers splayed, as if to shield the stories inside. You want to call that pro-life? I call it cruelty dressed in courtroom robes. I call it punishment without crime. I call it grief being dragged into jail cells and left there to rot. Her voice softened, barely. You think these laws stop abortion? Number, they don't. They just punish pain. They criminalize tragedy. They bury women before they're even dead. She looked directly into the camera now, not for politics, but for the people watching who had been afraid to speak. If you've lost a pregnancy and feared someone might accuse you of murder, you're not alone. If you've been scared to go to the hospital, scared to tell a nurse the truth, you are not the only one. She tapped the folder once, just once, like a judge with a gavel, except this was no trial, this was a reckoning. This isn't just paperwork, this is the future, unless we change it. And as the last echoes of Crockett's voice faded into the walls like the closing notes of a requiem, the entire hearing room seemed to stop breathing. Not a chair creaked, not a paper rustled. Even the hum of electronics and faint coughs that normally colored the air in Capitol chambers vanished into a void of reverent stillness. And in that void, all eyes turned, slowly, unavoidably, to Marjorie Taylor Greene. The cameras caught it before the humans did. A slow pan, a gentle zoom, the kind of movement used in film when the director wants to show the precise second something breaks. Her face, moments earlier, bold, blistering, full of fire, was now motionless, like she'd been hit not by words but by something heavier. Truth, grief, exposure. Her eyes, usually so quick to flash with defiance, seemed unsure where to land. She looked to her right, then left, then down at the table as if it might offer her a script, a lifeline, anything to interrupt the freefall she suddenly found herself in. Her lips parted, just slightly, as if forming the first syllable of a rebuttal. But nothing came, not even a breath. Her tongue pressed against her teeth, then retreated, her jaw clenched, not from strength, but from the effort of holding back whatever instinct came next. To yell, to cry, to flee, to disappear. But she was stuck, and worse, she was visible. Not just to those in the chamber, but to the entire country watching from laptops, phones, televisions. There was no spin in her eyes now, no swagger, no smirk. She tried to blink, but even that looked delayed, like her brain couldn't catch up with what had just happened. Her signature armor, rhetorical aggression, media-savvy provocation, performative patriotism, none of it mattered in this moment. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just out-argued her. She dismantled the scaffolding Greene had built her entire political identity on. She hadn't shouted her down. She hadn't insulted her. She had exposed her. With facts, with stories, with names, with truth so raw and so specific that no one, not even Greene herself, could deny what it meant. And now Greene sat there, live on national television, with every light on her and no shadows to retreat into. Her hands were clasped too tightly, her shoulders drawn up, subtly defensive. Her mouth moved again, as if to say something, anything. But again, the silence won. It was louder than her voice had ever been. One of her aides leaned forward slightly, like they were ready to jump in, to reset the rhythm, to whisper an escape hatch. But they didn't, because there was no salvaging this moment. There was only enduring it. And in that exact frame, the camera held unwavering, Marjorie Taylor Greene looked no longer like a warrior. She looked like a woman who had just been seen for the first time without the shield of outrage, the armor of slogan, the mask of certainty. And what was revealed underneath wasn't strength, it was smallness. The kind that comes when the noise runs out and all that's left is the truth, and how little room you had left to stand in. This was the moment no edit could erase, no spin could recover. It wasn't dramatic because someone yelled. It was unforgettable because someone finally couldn't. And as the tension from Crockett's last words still rippled through the hearing room like the aftershock of something far more seismic than speech, she didn't pull back. She didn't allow the silence to settle into comfort. Instead, she leaned forward again, slow and deliberate, locking her eyes onto Marjorie Taylor Greene with a kind of unwavering focus that made the entire room feel like it had tilted in that direction. There was no fire in her expression, no outrage, just truth. Cold, director, inescapable. Her voice was quieter now, but sharper. Let me ask you something. Not as a politician, not as an opponent, but as a mother. She paused, not for drama, but to let the words settle into the soil of Greene's defenses. If your daughter, your own child, came to you one day, crying, terrified, and told you she had been raped, would you look her in the eye and say, "You have to keep that baby"? Would you force her to carry a daily reminder of her trauma, of her pain, of what was taken from her? Crockett's tone never rose. It didn't need to, because it wasn't a question designed to provoke. It was a question designed to expose. The room was dead still. Greene didn't answer. She blinked once, then again, and her eyes flicked away. Not toward her staff, not toward the camera, but to some vague middle distance, like she was searching for an exit that wasn't there. Her hand moved, barely, and rested on the edge of the desk. Not confident, not firm. It gripped the wood with the tension of someone holding themselves still, as if movement might shatter whatever mask she had left. Her lips parted slightly. For a second, it seemed like she might say something, but nothing came. Nothing she could say would survive the weight of that question. And Crockett just watched her, not with malice, but with the clarity of someone who had sat across from too many women with shaking hands and hollow eyes. Women who had been told they had to endure, that they had no choice. She wasn't asking for a gotcha moment. She was asking because somebody had to, because too many lawmakers had written laws with ink but never with empathy, because this question wasn't hypothetical in the real world. It was horrifyingly, devastatingly common. Then Crockett spoke again, even softer this time, her voice almost like a prayer, except there was no comfort in it. No one, she said, the words slow and deliberate, should be forced to live in hell because of what someone else did to them. She let the weight of that truth fall. It didn't need explanation. It didn't need elaboration. It was the kind of truth that cuts clean. Around the chamber, no one moved. No one whispered. Even the chairwoman sat in stillness. And Greene, so often the loudest, so often the one with an answer for everything, sat frozen, her silence wrapped around her like a second skin, cracking at the seams. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett had not only asked a question no one wanted to answer, she had revealed just how cruel the silence really was. And as the hearing slowly returned to order, as the chairwoman finally found her voice again to move the agenda forward, everyone in that room knew the moment had already passed them by, and it was never coming back. The words had been spoken. The silence had done its damage. The truth had landed like a meteor. What followed now, procedure, protocol, posturing, was hollow noise compared to the reckoning that had just occurred under the bright lights of the committee room. But outside those walls, everything was just beginning, because the cameras hadn't just recorded it. The internet had consumed it. Within minutes, the clip surfaced. First from a staffer's shaky phone footage uploaded to Twitter, captioned in all caps. Crockett just bodied MTG in real time. Then came the official C-SPAN cut. Clean angles, perfect audio, a 5-minute monologue that felt more like a closing argument in a trial no one realized they were on the jury for. By noon, it had passed 100,000 views. By evening, it was trending on TikTok, stitched into montages with dramatic music, black and white filters, and phrases like, "This is how you carry the truth into battle." But what made it viral wasn't just the content, it was the feeling. It wasn't politics, it was real. No talking points, no shouting matches. Just a woman refusing to blink while demanding the country look itself in the mirror. On a farm just outside Chillicothe, Ohio, 67-year-old Doug Weller watched the video on his phone in the cab of his combine. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, dust catching gold in the air, and Doug sat there long after the clip ended. He ran a hand down his face, then replayed the part where Crockett asked, "Would you force your own daughter?" He didn't have a daughter. He had 3 sons. But for some reason, the question sat on his chest like weight he'd never felt before. Later that night, he typed a comment under a repost of the video on Facebook. It said simply, "I don't agree with everything she stands for, but that right there, that was the first time I've seen someone tell the truth without trying to sell it." In a diner off Route 12 in Kansas, 2 retired school teachers pulled the video up on a cracked tablet, watching between bites of pecan pie. One turned to the other and whispered, "She said what we used to be afraid to teach." In a high school civics class in Detroit, a student asked their teacher, "Why don't they all talk like that?" On a bus ride through Atlanta, a teenage girl with headphones on took them out. Mid-video, just to show the woman sitting next to her. "Watch this," she said, eyes wide. "She's not playing." The most powerful feedback didn't come from pundits or anchors. It came from people like Rosa, a single mother in San Antonio, who sent Crockett's office an email with no subject line, just 5 words in the body, "Thank you for seeing us." Or from Malik, a former pastor in Birmingham, who posted on Threads, "My faith tells me to value life, but this woman reminded me that valuing life also means valuing mercy." Meanwhile, the backlash stirred, but it sounded flat, mechanical. Greene posted a clip of her own, sliced at the most convenient angle, with a caption that screamed, "Democrats celebrate abortion while killing the family unit." But the comments beneath it told a different story. You didn't answer her question. She didn't yell. She didn't call you names. Why were you so shaken? You got quiet. That said everything. On cable news, the spin machine spun. Anchors framed the hearing as a sign of deepening partisan division. But the audiences didn't care about that angle. They weren't quoting the politics. They were quoting Crockett, word for word. "You scream about life," she had said, "but you don't give a damn about the people living it." That line alone had been turned into 1,000 memes, graffiti on protest signs, stitched into T-shirts. Not because it was flashy, but because it was true. Inside her office, long after the hearing ended and the corridor lights dimmed, Jasmine Crockett sat with her back straight, eyes scanning the screen of her phone as hundreds of messages poured in. There were trolls, there were threats, there always were, but she focused on the ones that mattered. The one from a nurse in Georgia who wrote, "I watched a girl die from sepsis after a miscarriage because her doctor was too afraid to intervene. Thank you for not pretending this is okay." Or the voicemail from a trembling voice, barely above a whisper, "I was 13. I kept quiet. You didn't. Thank you." She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to hold the gravity of it all. She hadn't planned to go viral. She hadn't come to perform. She came to tell the truth. And for once, the country didn't just hear it, they felt it. Not in the way you feel a clever line or a good speech, but in the way you feel a warning siren in your bones. And somewhere, in a house she would never visit, a little girl sat at a kitchen table while her mother played the clip from her phone. The girl didn't understand all the words, not yet, but she saw something that stuck. A woman who didn't look away. A woman who didn't flinch. A woman who sat in the halls of power and said what needed to be said. Slowly, the girl reached for her homework. Math could wait. She wanted to write down that woman's name, Jasmine Crockett. Because sometimes the truth doesn't win the argument. Sometimes it ends it. And while the viral clips ricocheted through every corner of the internet, spliced, stitched, amplified into memes, montages, debates, there was something far more intimate, far more powerful unfolding beneath the noise. It didn't come with flashing headlines or blue check marks. It didn't make it onto cable panels or Twitter trends. It came in the quiet hum of inboxes, in the fragile ring of late-night voicemails, in the shaky scrawl of handwritten letters sliding through the Capitol mailroom. Messages from people who hadn't planned to speak, who never imagined they would. But Jasmine Crockett's words had opened something too old to name and too raw to contain. That night, as the lights of Washington dimmed and the echo of the hearing slowly slipped beneath the surface of a city built to forget, Crockett remained in her office, alone. The glow of her monitor cast soft shadows across the stacks of folders, policy drafts, coffee cups gone cold. She hadn't changed out of her suit. Her heels were still on. Her back was still straight. But her eyes, tired but alert, were fixed on a single open email. The subject line was blank, the sender unknown. But the words inside, they landed differently. "My daughter watched your hearing beside me. She's 14. She cried, not because she was scared, but because for the first time someone said what I never had the courage to say. Thank you." The sender's name was Elise. Idaho, small town, no further details, no politics, no hashtags, just a mother writing from the edge of something so many women live on. Silence. Crockett stared at the message for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. What could she say to a mother who had carried her truth like a secret wound, only to have it cracked open by a stranger's voice through a screen? What could she offer to a daughter who had seen her mother's pain reflected back to her, not in suffering, but in strength? Crockett didn't know them. She probably never would. But this was no longer about names or places or party lines. This was about the invisible weight women carried until someone dared to speak it aloud. She rose from her chair, not fast, not slow, just steady. Her body ached with the fatigue of the day, but there was something deeper keeping her upright, something rooted, something earned. She crossed the room toward the tall window overlooking the Capitol dome, its marble curves glowing soft beneath the night sky. It stood there timeless, unmoved by emotion. The same building that had crushed dreams, delayed justice, and sanitized suffering behind legislative language. The same building where policies were written in ink but enforced in blood. And yet, tonight, something had shifted. Not outside, not in the architecture, but in the air, in the quiet, in the people who had watched, not as voters but as witnesses. Crockett placed her hand against the glass. It was cold, unforgiving, but real, like the truth. She could see her reflection faintly. Dark eyes, a tired mouth, the faintest crease between her brows from years of frowning at injustice. She didn't look victorious. She looked tired, but there was no regret in her face. She let the silence linger for a while. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything left unsaid for too long. Full of voices that had been choked by fear, politics, power. Full of women like Elise, who had swallowed their pain because there had never been room for it in the conversation. Until now. Then just above a whisper, she spoke, not to the room, not even to herself, but to the space between policy and personhood. Policy is words, she murmured, but words decide the fate of real people. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. That sentence was enough, a truth too simple for applause, too painful for sound bites. She stood there a moment longer, letting it settle, letting the weight of it fold into her bones. She thought of Alina, of Lettice, of Marjorie, of all the names in that folder and the ones that would never be written down. She thought of Elise, of Elise's daughter, and of the millions of women watching, not for entertainment, but for survival. Then slowly she stepped away from the window, not because she was done, but because the fight was far from over, and she knew now they weren't alone anymore. Morning in D.C. arrived as it always did, gray light creeping between marble columns, the city shaking off its sleep beneath layers of ceremony and noise. But inside the halls of Congress, something felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves had listened to what was said the night before and were still carrying the weight of it. In Jasmine Crockett's office, the lights flicked on slowly. Her staff came in early, though none of them said much. They didn't need to. The air was thick with aftershock, not from scandal, but from truth. The inbox had filled overnight, hundreds of new messages. Some came from recognizable names, editors, state representatives, legal scholars. But most were anonymous, first names only. Cities barely known. Rural zip codes with no mayor and maybe one high school. Women who didn't know they had something to say until Crockett's voice cracked something inside them open. An aide sat quietly reading through the subject lines. "Thank you for seeing us. I lost a baby. I went to jail. I've never told anyone this, but..." There were thousands of them, raw, shaking, furious, grateful. Some were paragraphs long, pouring out stories that had never been spoken aloud. Others were a single line, "She said what I couldn't." In a small rural town in Arkansas, a midwife named Carla wrote that she'd walked away from her practice because the fear of prosecution outweighed her ability to help. In Ohio, a former deputy sheriff sent in a 2-sentence message. "I arrested a woman for a miscarriage once. I can't sleep." But it wasn't just women writing. A mechanic in Montana said he watched the hearing while fixing a carburetor. His niece had been assaulted 2 years earlier. The family hid it. No one called the police. He'd always thought that was wrong until he watched Crockett speak. "Now I get it," he wrote. "We didn't trust the system to treat her like a person. You proved we were right." In a church in Mississippi, a pastor told his congregation, "What she said may make you uncomfortable, but the cross wasn't built for comfort. It was built for truth." And in a Native American reservation in South Dakota, A grandmother gathered her daughters and granddaughters in her trailer and replayed the clip again and again, translating slowly, pausing after every line Crockett said. Her voice trembled when she reached the part. No one should be forced to live in hell because of someone else's crime. She stopped the Sheila video, looked at the girls around her and said, "We don't have to be quiet anymore." Across the country, something had begun to shift. Not a revolution, not yet, but a reckoning, a recognition that the lives policy forgets are real, that dignity isn't a political agenda, it's a right. In town after town, Crockett's voice had done something no media campaign or televised debate could. It humanized pain. It stripped away the slogans, the fundraising language, the carefully rehearsed statements, and forced people, many for the first time, to confront what these laws really did, what they cost. In Kentucky, a nurse practitioner wrote, "You're the first person I've seen talk about miscarriage like it's not a crime scene. Thank you. I've watched too many women beg for help while doctors stood frozen, afraid of prison." In Utah, a teenage girl recorded a voice message in tears. "I was raped last year. I didn't tell my mom. I was going to kill myself. But I watched you and I realized I'm not the only one." And in the Bronx, a 72-year-old retired librarian wrote the simplest note of all. "I thought this country had forgotten how to feel. You reminded me it hasn't." Not every reaction was praise, of course. Some of the responses were vicious. Threats, screeds, accusations that she was promoting murder, that she was a disgrace to the nation, that she had no business speaking in public. But none of it stuck, not like her words had stuck, because those voices were loud, but hollow. The people writing from pain, they weren't loud, they were deep, and that depth resonated far longer than outrage ever could. Meanwhile, in media rooms and editorial boards, producers scrambled to catch up. The networks ran the clip late, buried between more comfortable stories. But they had to run it, because the public wasn't waiting for permission. They were already watching, already discussing, already remembering. In a living room in El Paso, a family of 5 watched the full hearing on YouTube. The father, who had voted Republican in every election since he was 18, turned to his wife and said, "I don't agree with everything she said, but she wasn't lying." His teenage daughter said nothing, just nodded, and then saved the video to her phone. At a barbershop in Atlanta, the hearing played on repeat. No sound, just subtitles. Every time Crockett's name appeared, the barbers would pause, lean in, shake their heads. One said, "She didn't flinch, man. You saw that?" She looked Greene dead in the eye and didn't flinch. In classrooms and hospitals and prisons, the hearing played, not as entertainment, not even as politics, but as a moment of clarity. It became required watching not because it was sensational, but because it was true. And back in D.C., the halls of Congress were quieter than usual. Staffers passed each other with nods instead of chatter. Even Greene's team kept their heads down. There was nothing to spin. The footage was everywhere. The silence she couldn't fill had spoken for her. Inside Crockett's office, her team gathered mid-morning to debrief, but there was little to say. No strategy, no next move. They all felt the same thing. Something had shifted, not in the headlines, in the people, in the way they felt, in the way they were finally saying what they had carried in silence for too long. Crockett finally stepped into the room, coffee in one hand, the printed email from Elise in the other. Her team quieted. She looked at them, then at the stacks of new letters, messages, voices waiting to be heard. She set the coffee down, and in her voice there was no fanfare, no fire, just resolve. "Let's read them all," she said, "because policy doesn't change just from passion. It changes when people see that their pain has witnesses. It changes when voices rise, not in unison, but in truth." And Jasmine Crockett was ready to listen, because yesterday she had spoken for them. Today she would fight for them. For most moments in politics, no matter how loud or shocking, the shelf life is short. Headlines cycle out in hours. Social media burns through outrage like dry grass, leaving only smoke behind. Even the biggest televised clashes fade beneath the weight of tomorrow's scandal, the next viral clip, the next story demanding attention. But not this time. Jasmine Crockett's voice didn't fade. It lingered. Not because she shouted louder, but because she didn't. Not because she dominated her opponent, but because she exposed something far more dangerous, a system that was willing to legislate pain and call it protection. Her words weren't crafted to trend. They weren't clean sound bites made for campaign ads. They were too real for that, too raw, too heavy to forget, and America didn't forget. In the weeks that followed, the clip continued to circulate, not just in progressive circles, not just among journalists or academics, but in communities that Washington had long dismissed as invisible. People who had stopped expecting anyone to speak for them suddenly found themselves replaying Crockett's words again and again. Not because they needed convincing, but because they needed validation. Proof that someone, somewhere in power, got it. In a small clinic in rural Nebraska, a nurse pinned Crockett's quote, "No one should be forced to live in hell because of someone else's crime," to a corkboard next to emergency hotline numbers. Patients read it while waiting for their prescriptions. One woman whispered, "That's the first time I've seen something on that wall that felt like it was written for me." In a community college in Oregon, a professor scrapped the last 2 weeks of her curriculum and replaced it with a new unit. When truth enters the room, language, law, and lived experience. She played the full 5-minute exchange from the hearing. Her students didn't take notes. They just listened. One student, a first-generation Latina, stayed after class and said quietly, "I thought I was crazy for feeling what I felt." But she made it feel real. It wasn't just young people, not just women, not just Democrats. Something deeper had cracked, something that had been stretched too far for too long without release. Crockett's voice had given it shape. At first, she avoided the interviews, declined the Sunday shows. She didn't want this moment twisted into a narrative of political branding, but eventually she agreed to speak, once. A local journalist from Dallas, a black woman, reached out. The two met in a quiet cafe, no cameras, just a mic between them. The conversation aired on public radio late on a Thursday night. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't flashy, it was just honest. "Were you trying to make a point?" the journalist asked. "No," Crockett said. "I was trying to stop the bleeding." That line echoed harder than any campaign slogan. After that, requests flooded in, not from networks, but from people. Town halls, health forums, teacher unions, survivor circles, not to campaign, not to give speeches, but just to talk, to sit down and be present in rooms where women still carried shame for miscarriages, where girls still whispered the word rape like it could curse the air, where parents wondered what they would do if it happened to their child, and realized they'd never dared to ask that question before. But Crockett showed up. She didn't come with cameras, she didn't bring consultants. She came with a notebook. And she listened. In one church basement in Tulsa, she sat across from a woman who had miscarried twins and then been interrogated by police for possible intent to self-induce. The woman sobbed through the story, ashamed, exhausted. Crockett held her hand. No words, just presence. That alone, the woman later said, made her feel more heard than all her court appearances combined. But Crockett didn't stop at listening. In Congress, she got to work. She co-sponsored a bill that demanded legal protections for women experiencing miscarriage and pregnancy loss. Simple, clear language. No arrests, no charges, no questions unless evidence of a violent crime exists. It wasn't a sweeping overhaul. It wouldn't fix everything. But it was a beginning. And that's how real change starts. Not in waves, but in seeds. The bill faced resistance, of course. It didn't pass. Not on the first try. But that wasn't the point. The point was that it existed, that it had a name, that the people who'd once been forced into silence now saw a document with language that reflected their lives, their pain, their right to not be punished for their bodies. And while Crockett continued the work, the country kept remembering. In Iowa, a high school held an essay contest. The topic, "Who do you trust to tell the truth?" Dozens of essays named Crockett. One student wrote, "She didn't sound like a politician. She sounded like someone who knew what pain felt like and refused to let it be ignored." In Texas, a group of mothers organized a donation drive for reproductive health clinics under a single quote, "Policy is words, but words decide the fate of real people." That sentence, spoken so quietly at the window, away from the cameras, had found its way onto murals, onto pins, onto billboards in places where women still drove 4 hours just to find a clinic. Because what Crockett had done wasn't just confront Greene. It wasn't just win a debate or own the other side. It was deeper. She'd broken the fourth wall of political performance and reminded everyone, this isn't a show. These are real lives. These are real bodies. These are real consequences. And she never took credit for that. She didn't bask in the attention. She didn't try to spin it into a national brand, because that wasn't the goal. Crockett knew that when voices like hers get amplified, the world tries to contain them, to put them in a box, turn them into symbols. She refused that. She stayed present. She stayed real. And that's why the voice didn't fade, because it wasn't just her voice anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been silenced, every parent who had been afraid, every child forced to grow up too soon, every person who had once asked, "Why does no one say it out loud?" and finally heard someone say it. And as she walked the Capitol halls months later, nothing about her had changed. Same suit, same stride, same stare. But the eyes that followed her were different. They weren't dismissive. They weren't mocking. They were watching, listening, respecting. Even those who disagreed couldn't pretend she hadn't altered the air. Because when a voice tells the truth in a place built on pretending, it doesn't just leave a mark. It shifts the floor beneath your feet. And now, no one in that room, no one watching, could ever walk the same way again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.